In this tutorial, we're going to look at the basics of getting objects out of your 3D software and into Unreal. So here we have just a simple object, a simple mesh. And what I'll do first, before I talk about how to output this, is actually load up a project in Unreal. So over to Unreal, just loaded up the Unreal project browser. And we have projects that already exist. But what I'm going to do is just go into a new project. Now from here we have a couple of different things. We do have first person templates, we have flying templates, third person templates. Now just for the sake of the project that you're currently working on, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a blank template. So for creating something like a small room environment, we're not going to have any functionality on that. It's really just to show your models off. So blank template is fine. We're also using the blueprint template here, not the C# or the C++, using the blueprints, so we use that. So down here, there's some settings we can use. We can set what this is going to output to. So in our case, this is going to be desktop console. I leave this at maximum quality. And we can either choose to have this with starter content or without starter content. Now the starter content will give you a few meshes that you can work with and a few textures that you can work with. It all depends on what you want to do. So in this instance, I'm just going to start with starter content. If you were to start without that, you can always add that afterwards in the project. So let's give this a name. It's just saying I can't call this. So we can't start with a number on that. So just Room 3D project, and then I'm going to click on Create Project. And go through, and depending on the speed of the computer, could take a little while. I'm currently using 4.2.1.2. Now, if you have a newer version at home than you have on your computers at college, you need to be careful about this. You need to be using the same version or a version earlier. But note, if you do then save that, you won't be able to go back to a previous version. Hopefully done soon. Let's give this a chance to load up. And we get something like this. Okay, so this is the base level that this comes up with starter content in. And the first thing I'm going to do actually is change the way that I navigate around this. So currently I'm using the same sort of shortcuts that you can use in Maya. So you have Alt left drag will rotate around, Alt right button will zoom in and out, and Alt middle button will pan around. Now this is a reverse pan. So when I move to the left, the screen moves to the right. When I move to the right, the screen moves to the left. So straight away we can change that. I'm going to go to Edit, Editor Preferences, and I'm just going to go into Viewports. And over here we have this invert middle mouse pan. I'm just going to click on that, and I'm just going to close that. And now we just have the proper pan. Okay. So just some initial things, some very basics about Unreal. So I've already said about navigation. You can use the Alt button, left, middle mouse, right button. You can also use the standard game controls. So if I press down and hold the right mouse button, I can use W, S, A, and D to move around this. We can also use Q to move down and E to move up. Okay. If you find the camera's moving around a little too quickly, up here we have the camera speed. So if I take that down, same thing, right click and now move around. We're now moving a bit more slowly in the scene. So exactly how you would work in a game itself. Okay. Now in terms of the layouts and the windows, over here we have our modes, which includes any of the objects that we have inside of Unreal itself. And we're not really going to go through these at all in this introduction. We have paint, we have landscapes, we have, let's catch up, we have foliage, and we have geometry editing as well, which is more for when you're doing something like white boxing, or grey boxing, or orange boxing, depending on where you work. In this case, say we're just going to bring some meshes in, and we're going to start that way. So that's our modes. We have our main menus, and we have our main work area here. We have the objects that we have in our scene, so our outliner, and then we have the details down here, which basically give you the properties for anything we actually have clicked on. We also have world settings, which you may not have open. You can go to Windows and you can open up the world settings through there, down there, which gives you settings for the environment. Down here, we have our content browser, and you can view this in different ways. I prefer to have this sources panel, so then we have our menus, our folders, and then we can go into the content, so we can just see it in this way, but you can view it however you want to view that. Okay, and we have in here the starter content that I loaded up with this, and under there, if I just click into these, we have several different objects within there. Go back, so we have audio, we have blueprints, we have some props, so you can see these chairs and bits and bobs. Now, any of these, to get something into the scene, I can just simply grab one of these and just drag it in. And then, same as in our 3D software within Maya, we can control this by moving this over individual axes. Okay. We can also do that, so that's the W keyboard shortcut as well. We can also go in and rotate this over here, or use E, and that will snap to 10-degree increments. And I can press R, and we can scale that as well. Use our scale tool. We also have snaps up here as well. So on all of these different settings, this is our move, our rotate, and our scale. We can snap this to certain increments. And this is useful when you're snapping objects together. So say, for example, let me just move this camera speed up a little bit. Say, for example, we have this, and we want to snap this into place. So depending on the size of this, if I set the increments to larger on there, so let's say 100, then you can actually see the grid here. It's going to snap every 100 centimeters. And this is in centimeters as well. So this is 100 centimeters. This grid is now represented as 100 centimeters grid spacings. Okay, so it just means we can snap things together more quickly. Put that back to 10. And we can do the same with the rotation, and we can do the same with the scaling as well. Similarly, we can switch these off. So if we don't want any snapping, you can just click these off, and now that's just moving in a freeform manner with no snapping at all. We can do exactly the same with these as well. We want to do that without the constraints of these values. Okay. So the other thing we can do, we can view this in different ways. So we do have, let me just go into the perspective. So we can look at this from different views. So we can go onto a top view, can go on to bottom, left, front, etc., etc. Okay. Then we can also go back to our perspective. We can choose to see this either in lit mode, in unlit, which is taking the lights off, or we can see this as well in wireframe. This can become a bit problematic just because we have this sky dome around the entire scene, and that can be difficult to work with, which is our, let me just click on this, BP Sky Sphere. So actually what we can do to make this a bit easier in wireframe is to switch that off, and then we're just looking at our objects there as well. So any one of these we can just switch on and off by clicking on this icon over here. Click that back into lit mode. Okay. So that's the very, very basics of Unreal. I'm going to go back to the content. I'm going to start setting up now for our actual import. So I'm going to create a new folder. We can do that in a couple of ways. We can add new, and we can go to new folder. Or I can right click anywhere around here. So with my content clicked, right click, and we can add a new folder up here as well. So let me just create a new folder, and let's call this Maps. You can't have spaces in your name, so make sure you either identify it with capitalization or you put an underscore. So here we have our Maps folder. So from here, I'm just going to do a file. I'm going to do a new level. And we have several things on that. I'm going to do a default level. So in here, let's just go in and let's save this content. You may have put this in my starter content. Oh, if we can save it as well. So let me just go into here. Let's just do a save current. Go into our maps and let's call this Room 3D. And let's just save that. So this can be our starting point, okay? And this is a good starting point in here because we have some lighting already in place. We have our sky dome ready in place, so everything we need, even a reflection capture. So we're good to go. So what I'll do is just do a save all now, and that's going to save our project and make sure everything we've brought in is saved as well. So I'm going to go into Maya and just talk about the output options. So generally, we're going to output most of our objects, or pretty much all of our objects, as FBXs, which is Autodesk proprietary format, and it's pretty compatible. If you're bringing animations out, you would have to use the FBX format, or we could also use an OBJ as well, but I'll use FBXs for this. So there's some important things that we need to consider from Maya. The first one is scale. You want these to be real world scale. If you have this too small or too large, it will come into Unreal that way. And then you're just messing about resizing everything. So as I said, this works in centimeters, works in real world scale. We should be modeling in real world scale as well. Otherwise, it causes problems down the line in terms of workflow. So this is already set to real world scale. Where you can show this, I'm just going to create a cube. Press T on this, and I'm just going to set this to 180 centimeters by something like 40 or 60, which is a pretty good representation of around a 5'8", 6 foot character. Snap this in so that you can see the size of our table against the size of our character. And then if it's too small, you can just resize it up accordingly. So if I want to resize that, I can resize that up at that point. So this comes to my next thing. We want to get rid of any transforms on this and any history on this as well. So before you export it, do make sure we go into Modify Freeze Transformations. We also go to Edit, Delete by Type, History to get rid of any of that. That's important. I have already got UVs on this. So our UVs are laid out, ready to go. So obviously if you're applying materials within Unreal, then you need to have those UVs there. You can't create UVs within Unreal itself. It will do that for light mapping, but that's a completely different thing. So do create your UVs ready to go. The final thing really is this positioning world space in here. So if I was to export this right now, because I've scaled this, the feet are now sitting through this world grid. And if I export that out, we're going to have problems with that. And in fact, the best way to do this is to show you. So let's export this now. So I'm going to grab this. And there's a couple of ways I can export it. I can go to Game Exporter. So I can go in here. I can set our type and our path and everything else in here. I can do it that way. I'm just going to do it a slightly different way this time. It's a file. I'm going to do an export selection instead. So what I'll do is I'm just going to do this onto the let's put this into my documents. I have a work folder, and let's just call this. In fact, I'll just make a folder in here. Okay, create a folder called exports. So I'm going to save it into there. So file type FBX. I'm going to take out my smoothing groups, my smooth mesh. You can triangulate in here. You are best off not doing that, I find. You're best off actually doing that in Maya itself. But just to know that everything going into Unreal, you do really want to be triangulated. So, go into here. Let's just give this a name. Now, one thing you may want to do is actually give this a prefix as well. So if you're using these within Unreal, it's just easier to find. You don't end up having to rename this in Unreal itself. So I'm going to give this a prefix, SM_table. So SM standing for static mesh. And let's export that. So in Unreal, what I can now do is go into our scene. Again, I'll create another folder straight within our content folder. Just right click, do a new folder, and I call this static meshes. And then I can either click on this import here with our folder open, or again I can right click and we can do import, and in this case we're importing to game static meshes. Give this a second to catch up. Here we go. So in this case, it's going to here. It's going to my work folder. Did I call it room? Where are you? There we go. Exports. And let's just highlight that and open it up. Okay. So we have a couple of options in here. Auto generate collision. It's just going to create a collision around the table. So I'll leave that on for now. We'll talk about that at a different time. There's no skeleton on this, so I can keep that unchecked. Everything else is pretty much as it is. Just down here, I haven't actually created any textures for this, so I can click that off. And actually import materials I don't like to do. What that would do is import your Phong material that we've currently got assigned to this from MyRLT. I'm going to uncheck that because it's unnecessary. We're going to create the materials in Unreal itself. Okay, so everything else is good to go. Let's import. If I double click on that, go from my other window, drag that in. There I have my mesh. Okay. And to bring that into the scene, I can just simply drag and drop. If I want to zoom in this, I can use the same shortcut as Maya. I can just press F, focus in. And this is the issue. You can see on there that this is lining this up to the ground wherever the pivot point is. So you can see now that the feet are through the floor. So every time you bring this table in, what you would have to do is play around with that getting to the right place, which is a real pain to have to do that. So I'm going to go back to Maya. And I'm just going to make sure that this is sat on that grid. So I'm going to do a move this pivot point. So I'm going to do D and V and make sure I move the pivot point to align to one of these bottom verts. And let's just say a front or a side view. I'm going to press X down. It's going to snap that up so that's sitting perfectly on the grid. So let's grab that. Let's export selection. I'm just going to save straight over this. And then Unreal. I don't need to reload this or delete this and rebring it in. What I can do is click on my static mesh. I can right click and we can re-import. And there you see that fixes that straight away. So just bear that in mind with a pivot point. It's the same kind of thing that if actually you had your pivot point in the right place for your object, but say we had our object over here. Just to the side. Again, let me just export that selection. Export selection, okay. Go back into Unreal and let's just right click and re-import. See, it moved out of the way, and actually now you can see our pivot point is over here. So if we're to rotate this, it's rotating around that point, not its own center. And again, that can cause problems. Okay. So again, back in Maya, all I'll do is just press X down to snap to grid. Just move that back into the right place. So that's really important. Think about where you want your pivot point to be on your object, and then position your object around the home grid over the center, or put the object over this point where you want the pivot point to be. So say, for example, I was creating, let's just put this to one side. In fact, let me just re-export this. Export selection, over that. Okay. So let's say we were doing something like a cupboard, and I want to have the pivot point to the back of the cupboard, so when I push this against a wall, for example, it lines up perfect with a wall. So what I would need to do is just move this and move this into position kind of around there, if this was the back of my wall or back of my cupboard. So it's not where the pivot point is, it's where the object is sitting on this center point. Now I would move the pivot point just because it's easier to line this up. So if I move the pivot point there, and then I would snap that to the grid on that point there. And then I could output that out, and that will be in the right place. Or if we wanted, this is useful if you want to line these up against each other. So if I want another version of this lined up, let me show you sort of in Maya, we will be able to snap those. Just doing Control D's here and duplicating these, we're able to snap those next to each other quite easily based on that pivot point position. Okay. If you did want this to be in the center, you can do that. So let me just, what I have to do is let me just create a line through this. Just give me something to snap to. D and V, snap to that one now. And I can snap that to the grid there. But again, I still have the back of the wardrobe on this, which in this case is our x-axis at 0. You can lay that out. Go back into Unreal, just right click, and let's re-import. And there I have the object there. And we can drag in as many instances of this as we want as well. Okay. So that is just the basics of the Unreal interface, creating a project and knowing where things are, and then just quickly taking something out of Maya and bringing that into Unreal. And that's the end of that tutorial.